June 13th, 2000. At Pyongyang's Sunan International Airport, the tarmac was baked by the hot summer sun. A Boeing 737 descended from the sky, and this was not an ordinary flight. The doors opened, and out stepped the commander-in-chief of the Kimdom's sworn enemy, South Korean President Kim Dae-jung. For half a century, the North Korean state media had a very specific, highly curated list of titles for the man holding that top office. A fascist traitor, a puppet of the West, a running dog of American imperialism, a capitalist vampire sucking the blood of the Southern compatriots. Today, there were no insults. The red carpet had rolled out. Waiting at the bottom of the stairs, wearing his signature khaki battlesuit and a pair of elevated shoes, was our dear leader, Kim Jong-il. The two men smiled. They shook hands under camera flashes. And then, in a moment that must have caused a collective aneurysm among North Korea's old guard generals, the two leaders, who just happened to share the same surname, walk side by side to inspect the honor guard of the Korean People's Army. To the outside world, this looked like the dawn of a new, peaceful millennium. The leftist South Korean president Kim Dae-jung launched a so-called sunshine policy, designed to melt the Cold War ice. But for any analyst who knew enough about the Kim regime, this wasn't a newfound brotherly love. It was a masterclass in totalitarian survival. In the last part of our Reunification series, we covered how the 90s were a geopolitical disaster for the hermit Kimdom. The Soviet Union evaporated, and China embraced market economics, leaving Pyongyang diplomatically stranded. The regime desperately attempted to court the West and grudgingly entered the United Nations as a divided nation. The cross-recognition plan failed, and the old diplomatic playbook was officially dead. The grand dream of forceful reunification was buried under the rubble of the Cold War. Soon, the great leader would die, and the son would have to inherit this dying state. The country needed hard currency as well as international legitimacy. If you were the dear leader, what would you do? Ironically, the only place left to profit from was the very puppet regime the People's Army was trained for decades to destroy. The dear leader used every possible means to use the South as his diplomatic sponsor, a bridge to Europe, a shield against American pressure, and a giant unquestioning telemachine. This is part 3 of our DPRK foreign policy series. We will dissect how North Korea survived the post-Cold War era by promising peace while making bombs. There were the first Korean nuclear standoff, secret British side door negotiations, another very bizarre round of inviting the Pope to Pyongyang, and Seoul's diplomatic heavy lifting for the northern cousins. But before the story unfolds, it is time for our weekly ritual. A massive salute to our channel members who patronize our research and production. You are the sole financiers of this tiny studio, so we don't rely on state-directed smuggling operations to feed ourselves. Thank you sincerely. And for new comrades, consider hitting that subscribe button, and our supreme producer will appreciate it. Buckle up. Let's dig in.
I am pleased that the United States and North Korea yesterday reached agreement on the text of a framework document on North Korea's nuclear program. This agreement will help to achieve a long-standing and vital American objective, an end to the threat of nuclear proliferation on the Korean Peninsula. This agreement is good for the United States, good for our allies, and good for the safety of the entire world.
In the civilized world, when a nation's economy experiences a catastrophic freefall, its leader typically follows a very standardized playbook. They promise structural reforms, privatize inefficient state assets, fly to Washington to humbly request IMF loans, or, if things get truly desperate, just resign in disgrace and let another minister hold the bag. But North Korea is always a bit eccentric, and the Kim regime does not believe in resignations. It was the early 90s. The Soviet Union, which had happily subsidized the North Korean economy for decades with cheap oil and favorable trade deals, had vanished from the map. The new Russian Federation was under a shock therapy and demanded hard currency for anything. In the Kimdom, the factories were rusting into silence, the tractors ran out of fuel, and the state distribution system, the very lifeline of the population, couldn't provide anything. The regime desperately needed a new revenue stream. But how do you command respect and extract wealth when your country's chief exports are coal, squid, and juche ideological pamphlets? The factories could produce some low-value added commodities like fertilizers and garments. But factories needed energy. Energy imports needed hard currency. And the country's lack of financial credibility and poor human rights records barred it from any international loans. This systemic paralysis meant that the domestic industrial base, once the pride of the Juche ideology, was effectively being cannibalized for scrap. Without a reliable line of credit from traditional institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, the regime found itself in a socialist catch-22. It needed to spend money it didn't have to restart the engines of an economy that was no longer producing anything of value to the global market. The country's leadership understood it perfectly, and they knew their only remaining leverage was not economic, but atomic. North Korea turned toward the only commodity the West would pay a premium for: the absence of a regional catastrophe. If you point a radioactive gun at your own peninsula, maybe someone will start to foot your bills. This brings us to the first Korean nuclear crisis of 1993, a masterclass in geopolitical extortion. The story actually began in 1985, when the Kim regime made a deadly miscalculation. That year, North Korea had signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, largely to appease the Soviet Union, which had promised to build them a civilian nuclear power plant in return. Yet, in a true North Korean fashion, Pyongyang spent years playing a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game, stalling on the safeguards agreement required to let the global community inspect its nuclear facility. It was only in 1992 that the regime finally conformed. It grudgingly opened the gates of the clandestine Yongbyon nuclear complex for the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Take the IAEA as the global neighborhood watch for weapons of mass destruction, staffed by talented physicists armed with mass spectrometers. Pyongyang confidently handed over its paperwork to the inspectors, claiming they had only separated a tiny, innocent, purely scientific amount of plutonium from their 5-megawatt experimental graphite-moderated reactor. The officials were like, "Bro, we know it's all a matter of formality and political gestures. You are not really checking on us, right?" They essentially assumed that the Western bureaucrats would look at the ledgers, nod politely, and leave. Unfortunately for the dear leader, capitalist nuclear scientists were not socialist bureaucrats who muddled through their days. The IAEA took samples from the facilities and conducted rigorous radiochemical analysis. The science revealed a starkly different reality. North Korea had reprocessed plutonium on multiple undeclared occasions. The physicists essentially looked at the North Korean diplomats and said, "Comrade, your math is off by several potential nuclear warheads." So the IAEA demanded special inspections of 2 undeclared nuclear waste sites to verify the discrepancy. The leaders were not pleased. North Korea did not offer any clarifying paperwork. Instead, on March 12, 1993, Pyongyang invoked the supreme right of a sovereign state and announced its immediate withdrawal from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was the geopolitical equivalent of flipping over the Monopoly board because someone asked you to pay rent on Boardwalk. To be noted, no country had ever withdrawn from the NPT before. North Korea wasn't just breaking the rules, but essentially burned the rulebook on the front lawn of the international community. The crisis escalated with terrifying speed. The United States and South Korea resumed their team spirit joint military exercises, which Pyongyang chronically viewed as a rehearsal for a future invasion. The Pentagon began moving Patriot anti-missile batteries into South Korea. In Pyongyang, the state media went into overdrive, declaring a state of semi-war and plunging the capital into blackout drills. The diplomatic tension reached a boiling point in March 1994. During a working-level inter-Korean meeting, the North Korean delegate Park Yong-soo looked at his southern counterparts across the table in one of those blue huts of the Panmunjom demilitarized zone and decided to spice things up. These meetings were normally tedious, highly scripted negotiations filled with dry bureaucratic wording. But as the South Korean delegate warned of international sanctions, Park shot back with a threat that would instantly become the most infamous soundbite of the decade. "We do not want war, but we are not afraid of it," Park stated coldly. "Seoul is not far from here. If a war breaks out, Seoul will turn into a sea of fire, bulbada." It was a poetic, yet undoubtedly terrifying and utterly unhinged thing to say during a diplomatic parley, essentially a hostage threat. In Seoul, the public panicked. Supermarket shelves were instantly cleared of instant ramen, canned goods, and bottled water. The stock market shuddered. The Kim regime had suddenly discovered a profound geopolitical truth. In the post-Cold War era, fear is a highly tradable, highly lucrative commodity. By June, the peninsula was standing on the absolute precipice of a second Korean War. In the White House, Bill Clinton was seriously considering the Pentagon's plans for a preemptive surgical cruise missile strike on the Yongbyon nuclear facility to destroy the reactor before the plutonium could be extracted, just like what Trump did to Iran. The US military was ready to deploy tens of thousands of reinforcement troops to the peninsula. Aircraft carriers sailed toward the east. Simulations predicted that a full-scale war would result in over 1 million casualties, including tens of thousands of Americans, and cause trillions of dollars of damage to the global economy. The Kims found themselves staring down the barrel of total systemic collapse. The dynastic dream was on the verge of becoming a historical joke. But just as the clock neared its final stroke, a truly bizarre deus ex machina appeared to ease the standoff. The good guy, Jimmy Carter, former President of the United States, arrived with mission and style. Bypassing official diplomacy, Carter touched down in Pyongyang as a private citizen. He was greeted by Kim Il-sung, who was basically on his deathbed, but still managed to execute a masterclass in performance as the gentle, rational patriarch of the Korean country. They took a scenic boat ride along the Dae-jung River, chatted occasionally, and brokered a tentative agreement to pause the atomic pursuit for the price of direct engagement with Washington. In a flash of political theatre, the immediate threat of a nuclear inferno vanished overnight. Barely a month later, on July 8, 1994, Kim Il-sung died of a sudden heart attack. The nation collapsed into hysterical, state-mandated mass weeping. But behind the scenes, the successor Kim, our dear leader Kim Jong-il, took total control of the ongoing nuclear negotiations without skipping a single beat. He authorized his brilliant and utterly ruthless first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kang Sok-ju, to sit down with US negotiator Robert Gallucci in Geneva to hammer out the final price of North Korea's compliance. The resulting document, signed on October 21st, was called the Agreed Framework. And if you read the terms closely, it reads less like a strict non-proliferation treaty and more like the blueprint of a socialist bank heist. The Kimdom is going to rob the capitalist world, but the world leaders must shake the robbers' hands and thank North Korea for its attention and time. Under the Agreed Framework, North Korea agreed to freeze its 5-megawatt graphite-moderated reactor and related facilities to eventually dismantle them. They agreed to remain a party to the NPT and allow the IAEA monitors to stay in Yongbyon. In exchange, the United States, South Korea, and Japan formed an international consortium called the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. Their job was to build North Korea 2 brand new, state-of-the-art, proliferation-resistant light water nuclear reactors, with a total generating capacity of 2,000 megawatts. The reactors, with everything done, would cost roughly $4 billion and supposedly would solve North Korea's energy problem all at once. But building nuclear reactors takes years, and the Kim regime's factories were out of power now. So, to cover the energy loss of shutting down their illicit reactor, the United States agreed to organize the delivery of 500,000 metric tons of heavy fuel oil to North Korea, entirely for free, every single year, until the new reactors were completed. Furthermore, Washington promised to move toward full political and economic normalization and provided formal guarantees against the threat or use of nuclear weapons against the DPRK. Let the sheer generosity of this arrangement sink in. A bankrupt, starving, isolated dictatorship, whose conventional military was running out of food and weapons, had successfully bullied the sole remaining global superpower into financing its energy grid. The imperialist enemies were literally paying the Kim regime billions of dollars in infrastructure and heavy fuel oil just to stop building a bomb they weren't legally supposed to own in any case. For Kim Jong-il, the Geneva Agreed Framework was an absolute revelation. It was the genesis of a new operational philosophy that would dictate North Korean foreign policy for the next 2 decades. Pragmatic diplomacy. Let's think it through together. Traditional diplomacy involves negotiations, compromises, trust building, and agreement to international norms. That's how North Korea operated under the Soviet protection. But since 1994, Kim Jong-il mastered the dark art of weaponizing his own state's instability to extort everything the Kim regime needed. The dear leader discovered a fundamental flaw in the Western democratic psyche. Rational actors are terrified of irrational behaviors. If North Korea acted like a normal, developing country, it would receive nothing but condescending lectures from the UN, demands for human rights improvements, and pressure to open its markets. However, if North Korea acted like an unpredictable, suicidal rogue state holding a lit match over a powder keg, the international community would rush into the room with buckets of cash, free oil, and diplomatic recognition just to put out the fire. Pragmatic diplomacy meant stripping away any lingering romantic illusions about socialist brotherhood or ideological purity. Everything is transactional. You create a crisis, push the enemy to the absolute brink of war, then sit tight and wait for everyone to panic, and then you offer a solution to the very crisis you just created at an astronomical markup. It was the beginning of a new era. Korean reunification was no longer a goal, but an excuse to extort a better deal.
I hope that's not true. They are party to the non-proliferation treaty. They are not supposed to have nuclear weapons. They have been in non-compliance since 1993 in not enabling us to make sure that they do not have weapons. But if they now come and make it clear that they have weapons, this is the original sin. This is, runs contrary completely to the whole.
While Pyongyang projected a terrifying nuclear doomsday image to the international community, the internal reality was a catastrophe. The death of the great leader and mismanagement had led the country to plunge into the arduous march, a devastating famine. To understand how desperate things were, look no further than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These were the country's elites of the elites, the vanguard of the Juche diplomacy in the post-Soviet apocalypse. Yet, even the foreign ministry had run out of office supplies. The shortage was so severe that officials were literally taking old, used documents and boiling them in chemical reagents to dissolve the ink, just so they could dry the recycled pulp and have something to write on. Abroad, the situation was even more absurd. North Korean embassies, once fully funded outposts of socialist propaganda, were suddenly cut off from the central bank. Pyongyang told them to become self-reliant, which translated to, "There would be no more salaries or budget for heating bills. Go figure it out yourselves." To survive the harsh European winters, North Korean embassies in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe transformed into state-sponsored mafia syndicates. The brightest diplomats utilized their diplomatic immunity to run illicit cigarette smuggling rings across the Baltic Sea. Kim Jong-il, witnessing this pathetic reality, realized that his father's old diplomacy playbook was fundamentally incompatible with national bankruptcy. Revolutionary romance could not feed a country. The founding daddy demanded respect, insisted on being treated as a philosopher Kim, and refused to show any weakness to the imperialist enemies. But now, that dignity did not generate heavy fuel oil. Shamelessness does. Kim Jong-il's instruction to elite diplomats aboard in a great cynicism. He effectively told them to stop painting North Korea like a flawless workers' paradise. Play the fool, play the victim, pretend to be pathetic and hungry, so you can beg your enemies for food and mercy. Let the Western capitalists think they are reforming you through their generosity. With this survival strategy, Pyongyang needed a new target. The Americans were tied up with the agreed framework, and there wasn't much to do. Kim Jong-il needed a new diplomatic bridge to break his isolation, and perhaps Europe was the place to go. In 1995, through a series of highly secretive contacts, North Korean and British officials met in Geneva, Switzerland. Targeting the UK was a masterstroke of geopolitical calculation. Great Britain had never been a European nation. As America's closest ally, the diplomatic interests of the British were different from those of continental Europe. Washington wouldn't tolerate those smaller European countries engaging with a rogue state like North Korea. But if London opened a channel, the Germans, the Spanish, and the rest of the European Union would eventually follow. During these quiet talks, the British diplomats played by the standard Western rules. They laid out their terms rationally. We are willing to improve bilateral relations, but only if you sincerely implement your nuclear promises under the agreed framework and behave like a responsible member of the international community. The North Korean delegation, implementing the dear leader's pragmatic strategy, shot back with a mixture of feigned innocence and masterful gaslighting. They did not start a lecture on the Juche idea. Instead, they appealed to British vanity. Come on, mates, the Cold War is over. Britain is a proud, historic empire with a global legacy. Why are you still blindly following America's outdated confrontation policies? You don't need Washington's permission to talk to us. You should act independently, based on your own national interests. It was a brilliant psychological manipulation. A bankrupt, starving dictatorship lecturing the British Empire on the virtues of national sovereignty, while simultaneously asking them to open trade channels and to forget about the past rogue behaviours. The British, ever pragmatic, did not lose themselves in Korean flattery. They didn't walk away either. They agreed to continued political dialogue, cultural exchanges, and eventually to open English language training programs in Pyongyang. By a North Korean standard, this result was not bad. Kim Jong-il had successfully proven his point. His father's obsession with ideological purity had left the country isolated and starving. But the son's willingness to play the miserable fool had created a crack in the Western blockade. Europe was slowly warming up to the idea of engagement. But to truly hack the international system, to extract the billions of dollars required to keep the Kim dynasty afloat, North Korea needed someone else to do the heavy lifting. They needed a sponsor who was wealthy, politically motivated, and desperately eager to believe that the villain had made his true nuclear confession. Pyongyang needed a puppet, and right on cue, South Korea was about to elect a man who thought sunshine could cure uranium radiation.
I am glad to see you. I have wanted to meet you. So begins this historic meeting between the two Koreas. Parade and march of the People's Army. This is North Korea's most cordial reception of a visiting foreign dignitary.
Comrade, let us have a second for a philosophical question. Do you believe in criminal rehabilitation? When you capture a violent criminal, there are generally two choices. You can throw them in a dark, freezing cell and break their spirit with a baton. Or you can put them in a comfortable room, give them a warm meal, maybe even a game console, and offer them therapy, hoping that patience and kindness will eventually cure their antisocial behavior. Not an expert, but I personally do believe that recorrection works for some bad fellas. But what if the subject is a dynastic dictator holding 25 million hostages and actively building a nuclear arsenal? Can you hug a totalitarian regime into becoming a normal country? Short answer, no. And people had made too many mistakes to realize it. Back in the 70s, South Korea was equally a paranoid, hyper-militarized dictatorship. Its strategy for dealing with communism was pure, unadulterated eradication. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency didn't believe in rehabilitation. If you were caught reading Marxist literature or sympathizing with the North, the state dragged you into a basement and tortured you until you confessed. The national psyche was built on an iron-fisted, absolute anti-communist hatred. But in the liberalizing 80s, things started to change. The South Korean people fought back against the military junta, and democracy finally won. And with that hard-fought democracy came a profound, almost dangerous wave of political idealism. The old, violent anti-communist dogma began to soften. A new progressive movement took hold, looking up at the starving, bankrupt North not as a rabid dog that needed to be eliminated, but as a troubled, impoverished brother who just needed some love therapy. Therefore, to pull off the greatest diplomatic grift of the century, the dear leader needed an opponent blinded by exactly that kind of moral optimism. In 1998, swearing the presidential oath of office in Seoul, there was the ROK president, Kim Dae-jung. He was not another interchangeable anti-communist military general, but rather a titan of the South Korean pro-democracy movement. During the darkest days of the southern dictatorships, Kim was the ultimate dissident who was under years of house arrest and was once sentenced to death for treason. In 1973, secret agents literally kidnapped him from a hotel in Tokyo. They drugged him, dragged him onto a boat, tied heavy weights to his limbs, and were minutes away from throwing him into the freezing Pacific before the CIA intervened and buzzed the boat with an aeroplane to stop the assassination. Kim Dae-jung had survived the absolute worst of capitalist authoritarianism. He knew what political terror looked like, smelled like, and felt like. And yet, miraculously, his ultimate takeaway was not a desire for violent retribution. He held a stubborn belief in the power of non-violence, reconciliation, and engagement. If you treat your enemies with enough warmth and patience, they will eventually lay down their weapons. So, when he swore in the office, this belief was formalized as the South's official North Korea strategy, dubbed the Sunshine Policy. The name was lifted directly from the famous Aesop's fable about the sun and the wind competing to see who could make a traveler take off his heavy winter coat. The wind blows with furious, freezing aggression, but the traveler only wraps the coat tighter to stay warm. The sun, however, shines with gentle, persistent warmth, and eventually, the traveler voluntarily takes off the coat. Kim Dae-jung's geopolitical theory was beautifully simple. 50 years of military tension, economic sanctions, and screaming across the DMZ had only made the Kim regime wrap its totalitarian coat tighter. So now, Seoul would radiate the sunshine of unconditional economic aid, massive shipments of food and fertilizer, joint tourism projects, and the complete separation of political disputes from economic cooperation, to hug the Kim regime until it stopped being a dynastic dictatorship. The policy kicked off with quite some spectacles. In 1998, Chung Ju-young, the billionaire founder of the Hyundai Group, who was born in the northern half of the peninsula, drove a convoy of trucks carrying exactly 500 fattened cows across the militarized border as a gift to the north. It was called cattle diplomacy. You might think that, with your sworn enemy voluntarily giving up the confrontation, Pyongyang should be in a state of ecstasy, but the reality went completely opposite. When your enemy suddenly shows up at your fortified border with a herd of cows, a basket of muffins and fruits, you don't celebrate. You scan the muffins for anthrax, the apples for poison. To the deeply paranoid Pyongyang strategists, the Sunshine Policy wasn't a humanitarian rescue, but a Trojan horse wrapped in a warm hug. For decades, the Kimdom's grand strategy was to wait for South Korean progressives to overthrow their dictators and voluntarily submit to Pyongyang's benevolent rule. But being progressive doesn't equal being a communist. Kim Dae-jung wasn't a guerrilla fighter. He was the democratic leader of an economic juggernaut. It was the late 90s. South Korea was already a developed nation, exporting tech to the world, while North Korean diplomats were boiling scrap paper just to have something to write on. Kim Jong-il looked at the sunshine and saw the terrifying ghost of East Germany. Engagement was just a polite, capitalist wording for absorption. If South Korean tourists and businessmen flooded the north, his citizens would quickly realize that the so-called puppet South wasn't a starving American hellscape, but a thriving democracy where people owned cars and didn't know how to cook tree bark. So, for 2 years, Pyongyang violently rejected the sunshine by doing what it does best, sending spy submarines to the south and firing ballistic missiles over Japan. But eventually, bankruptcy forced the dear leader to lower his hand. He needed the South Korean cash cow. Just be cautious not to let people learn about democracy. He pivoted his propaganda machine and invented a new concept, 우리 민족끼리, meaning by our nation itself. He stopped attacking the Sunshine Policy and used it for his own interest. He told Seoul, "Yes, we are one blood. But to prove your brotherly love, you must send the aid unconditionally. Thanks for the fruits, but no thanks. We don't need any human rights inspections, and please keep the Americans out of it." It was a brilliant rhetorical trap that surgically stole South Korea's wallet. Seoul, desperate for a historical breakthrough, eagerly agreed. That is why Kim Jong-il walked out onto that red carpet in June 2000. Not because he suddenly liked peace, but because his Kimdom was too hungry, and the puppet South had just brought the all-you-can-eat buffet. What happened next was truly the geopolitical performance of a lifetime. Over the course of the 3-day summit, the commander-in-chief, who supposedly controlled the weather through magic, suddenly transformed into a jovial, magnanimous statesman. He personally rode in the same limousine as Kim Dae-jung and hosted lavish banquets, clinking glasses of expensive wine. 2 Korean leaders, surnamed Kim, went hand in hand, smiling for the international cameras. The resulting June 15th joint declaration was an absolute masterpiece of totalitarian misdirection. It promised to resolve the unification issue independently, noted some vague common elements in their respective political systems, and set up a few heavily televised reunions for separated families. The agreement changed absolutely nothing about the nuclear program or the artillery pointed at Seoul, but it gave Kim Dae-jung exactly the optical victory he needed to justify keeping the aid flowing. But the exploitation didn't stop there. Kim Jong-il's best stroke was turning the South Korean government into his own unpaid, highly effective international PR firm. Remember those European countries Pyongyang desperately wanted to court? A few months after the Inter-Korean Summit, the Nobel-bound Kim Dae-jung hosted the 2000 Asia-Europe meeting in Seoul, where South Korean diplomats begged the EU leaders to recognize North Korea behind closed doors. Their pitch was hopelessly optimistic. "Look, we have successfully tamed the beast. The dear leader has become a human again. If you open embassies and engage with him, he will surely reform the Kimdom." Caught up in the sunshine euphoria, countries like the UK, Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands announced diplomatic ties with Pyongyang. What a diplomatic miracle! But if you hacked the encrypted memos circulating inside the North Korean Foreign Ministry, there wasn't a single word of gratitude towards Seoul. Instead, the propaganda apparatus explained this wave of European recognition as the inevitable result of Kim Jong-il's incomparable geopolitical genius and intimidating military aura. The internal logic fed to the elites was breathtaking. The capitalist European states, trembling at the might of the Juche Revolution, were desperately rushing to Pyongyang to pay tribute before it was too late. The puppet opened the door, built the bridge, and paid the toll. Then, the North Korean state media stood at the finish line, claiming the leader had everything for its people's welfare. Now, North Korea had the American fuel oil, the South Korean cash, and those European embassies. To truly complete the illusion of the normal country costume, the only thing left was some spiritual validation. It was time to call the Pope again.
Open your hearts, open up your hearts to Christ. The deepest joy there is in life is the joy that comes from God and is found in Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
If you recall from our last episode, back in the early 90s, the great leader once had a wonderfully absurd idea to invite Pope John Paul II to Pyongyang. It was a desperate bid for international recognition that went hilariously wrong when state security accidentally discovered a genuine, secretly praying Catholic during their casting process for a fake believer. The plan was quietly suffocated by Kim Jong-il, who realized that inviting the world's most famous Catholic might accidentally cause a religious awakening, something uncontrollable for a cultic state that only allows Kim worship. But a decade later, the diplomatic weather had changed. Months before the historic Inter-Korean summit, Kim Dae-jung, a devout, baptized Roman Catholic himself, visited the Vatican. During a meeting with Pope John Paul II, the South Korean president suggested that the Pope visit North Korea to encourage peace. The Holy Father replied, with remarkable wisdom and prophecy, that if such a trip happened, it would be a miracle, but he was willing to give it a try. Fast forward to June, during the warm, lucrative glow of the Pyongyang summit. Kim Dae-jung formally relayed the Pope's interest to the dear leader. The diplomatic cables say that, hearing the idea, Kim Jong-il paused, casually asked how old the Pope was. Learned that the Pope was 80 at the time, the dear leader said, "Okay, then tell the Pope to come." Days later, the South Korean ambassador in Rome officially handed the Vatican an invitation on behalf of the North Korean dictator. Did the dear leader suddenly find God? Of course not. He was the only God of the Kimdom. It was all part of the sunshine performance. Kim Jong-il didn't want a mass. The plan was to let the Catholic president from Seoul, the communist monarch from Pyongyang, and His Holiness smile and shake hands for the camera. Remember, it's pragmatic diplomacy. A selfie with the Pope would leverage more aid from the Christian world. The Vatican considered the invitation, but replied with a very standard religious caveat. If the Pope visits, North Korea must allow resident Catholic priests back into the country to actually minister to the flock. With that ridiculous request, the Kim regime slammed the door shut. A photo op is great for propaganda, but allowing priests to walk around Pyongyang spreading ideas about a king higher than the supreme leader? Absolutely not. Just as the Polish Pope expected, there ain't no miracle for the communist regime. Even without the Pope, the European diplomatic campaign pushed forward. Following South Korea's tireless lobbying efforts, North Korea rushed to lock down formal ties with Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But they immediately hit a bureaucratic wall. These smaller European nations were willing to sign the papers, but they didn't want to spend millions building brand new embassies in Pyongyang. Instead, they proposed a practical workaround. Their existing ambassadors stationed in Seoul or Beijing would concurrently cover North Korea. For those Juche diplomats who were raised under Kim Il-sung's principles of absolute sovereignty and national dignity, this was pure blasphemy. Sharing ambassadors with the South implied that Seoul was the diplomatic center of the peninsula, and Pyongyang was just a side gig. The delegation resisted fiercely, refusing the terms and expecting praise from headquarters for fiercely defending the nation's pride. Unexpectedly, Kim Jong-il was furious. He scolded those diplomats for the lack of geopolitical sensibility. The clock was ticking. The final diplomatic channel to the West was closing fast. In the US, Bill Clinton was packing his bags, and a Texan man named George W. Bush was preparing to enter the White House, bringing a cabinet full of hawkish hardliners. North Korea needed these European ties finalized immediately, before Washington could pressure Europe to back off. The socialist glory was long gone. Now, diplomats must swallow their pride and accept the concurrent ambassadors and other humiliating requests, like having stationed journalists in Pyongyang. The principles of Juche are eternal, until George W. Bush started preparing for ground invasions. From a purely Machiavellian standpoint, Kim Jong-il was absolutely right. The dear leader looked at the shifting geopolitical winds and correctly predicted the incoming storm. the Bush administration was gearing up to label North Korea part of the axis of evil. The United States military was preparing to dismantle regimes in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein, who had given up his weapons of mass destruction, would soon be pulled out of a dirt hole by American soldiers. To Kim Jong-il, international law was a fairy tale. The only thing that actually stopped an American tank was a credible nuclear threat. In contrast, the Europeans, enjoying the fake sunshine, were all too eager to play the savior to the falling Kim regime. And nobody played it as well as the Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson. In May 2001, Persson led a high-level EU delegation straight into the Juche capital. Sitting directly across from Kim Jong-il, Persson did what he thought was incredibly brave. He brought up the human rights issue right to the dictator's face. Persson bluntly said that North Korea's horrific abuses would block its acceptance into the international community. And for the mutual trust, North Korea would be better off halting its ballistic missile testing. And what did Kim Jong-il do? Did he change his mood and threaten to turn Stockholm into a sea of fire? No, the leader smiled. Playing the role of a pragmatic statesman to absolute perfection, the dear leader casually agreed to a temporary missile moratorium and promised to open a formal dialogue on human rights. Persson left Pyongyang floating in the air. He returned to Europe boasting of a historic, world-changing diplomatic triumph. The beast was tamed, really. The dictator was listening to reason and history's call. It was the classic trap of the modern democracy. Western leaders, constrained by election cycles, are so desperate for a legacy-defining, Nobel Peace Prize-worthy photo op that they will blindly believe a totalitarian God King who tells them exactly what they want to hear. Persson genuinely thought he had secured peace for the world. But Kim Jong-il knew he had just bought himself another 5 years of geopolitical protection and nuclear development. When European and North Korean officials finally met in Brussels to begin this historic human rights dialogue, the North Korean delegation turned the agreement into a filibuster headache. They fought a brutal, hours-long semantic war, demanding the meeting be labelled a mere contact, absolutely refusing to let the words dialogue or meeting be printed on the official paperwork. The linguistic fistfight lasted several days, and North Korea finally agreed to discuss human rights, while refusing to call the discussion a discussion. While almost all naive Europeans were fooled by the smart-ass Koreans, one country stood out. France outright refused to join the European Recognition Party. Paris criticized the sudden, desperate rush to embrace Pyongyang, demanding actual, verifiable evidence that the regime had abandoned its nuclear program before any hands were shaken or embassies were opened. This stung Pyongyang deeply. North Korea had long maintained a quiet representative office in Paris. The Kim elites absolutely loved France. It was their favorite playground for tax-free luxury purchases, Hennessy cognac, and advanced medical treatment for the ruling family. Kim Jong-il desperately wanted formal French recognition to complete his grand diplomatic illusion. But to this very day, France remains one of the only countries in the European Union that officially does not recognize the existence of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. They looked at the Kimdom's normal country costume, smelled the caveat, and politely declined the invitation. Clearly, Parisians do not believe in criminal rehabilitation. For a brief, surreal window at the dawn of the new millennium, the Korean peninsula was having a dangerously intoxicating illusion. Treaties were signed. The dear leader was clinking glasses with the South Korean president. European capitals were dispatching diplomats and journalists to Pyongyang, and Korean families reunited, crossing the heavily fortified militarized zone with family picks instead of rifles. It is easy to look back today and mock Western politicians or the South Korean government for their desperate, almost pathetic naivety. But perhaps the most tragic irony of the Sunshine Era is that this fake optimism actually infected North Korea itself. Inside Pyongyang, the bureaucratic elites and the lucky diplomats stationed abroad began to genuinely believe that the worst was over. The catastrophic famine was receding, South Korean cash was flowing in, and European embassies would soon open up trade and dialogue. They thought they had successfully infiltrated the international community. They believed the dear leader had outsmarted the capitalist world, securing their luxury lifestyles and their imported French cognac without ever having to change a single fundamental flaw in their economy. But all of it was a delusion. The fundamental nature of the Kimdom cannot be altered by a warm hug, a diplomatic summit, or a billion-dollar aid package. Why? Because North Korea is not a normal developing nation experiencing geopolitical growing pains. It is a highly engineered survival mechanism built exclusively to protect a single holy bloodline. It is a hostage situation masquerading as a sovereign state. At its core, the Kim regime's only true exports are fear and threat. The Kim dynasty knows that the moment the country actually opens up, the moment it genuinely integrates into the global community, the illusion of their godlike supremacy shatters. And if that happens, the Kim family ends up facing the absolute wrath of their own starving citizens. The Sunshine Era was unbelievably promising, but the geopolitical weather was about to change with violent suddenness. The calendar flipped. A new, hawkish administration took the White House, and following the tragic morning of September 11th, George W. Bush stood before Congress and explicitly branded North Korea as a charter member of the axis of evil. The diplomatic niceties evaporated. The 1994 agreed framework collapsed into dust. The Kimdom was about to plunge back into the dark, radioactive art of crisis diplomacy. In October 2006, Pyongyang detonated its very first underground nuclear device, permanently altering the balance of global power and proving that the regime's endgame was never peace, but atomic extortion. And looming over all of this geopolitical chaos is the shadow of mortality. Kim Jong-il was aging, his health was failing, and behind the heavily guarded walls of the Kumsusan Palace, the absolute necessity of a nuclear deterrent was tied directly to a new, highly secretive project, paving the way for a young, untested, Swiss-educated successor named Kim Jong-un. The sunshine was over. The fallout is coming.